In this module, we shall understand the general and partial approach to international trade equilibrium. International trade theories have proven that international trade enhances the global welfare if the trade is barrier free. The benefit received from free movement of goods are shared by the trade partners, which depends on their terms of trade. The terms of trade of a nation is defined as the ratio of the price of its export commodity to the price of its import commodity. Since in a two-nation world, the exports of a nation are the imports of its trade partners, the terms of trade of the latter are equals to the inverse of the term of trade of the former. As supply and demand considerations change over time, the volume and the term of trade will change. An increase or improvement in the nation's terms of trade is usually regarded as beneficial to the nation in the sense that prices that the nation receives for its exports rise relative to the prices that it pays for its imports. In a two-nation world, an improvement in the terms of trade of one nation necessarily involves a deterioration in the trade partner's terms of trade. If import prices rise faster than the export prices, the terms of trade have deteriorated. A greater volume of exports has to be sold to finance a given amount of imported goods and services. Typically, this leads to a fall in the standard of living because the imports of food and technology are more costly. The terms of trade fluctuate in line with the changes in export and import prices. The exchange rate and the rate of inflation can both influence the direction of any change in the terms of trade. The terms of trade decide the benefits of international trade under different conditions. If the effect of international trade is analyzed through the simple demand and supply condition, then the resultant analysis is known as partial equilibrium analysis, whereas the general equilibrium analysis uses offer curves which are derived from the production possibility frontier and the indifference curve.
After studying this module, you shall be able to know what does the term partial equilibrium and general equilibrium analysis mean in the context of international economics, what is the difference between two and when to use partial and general equilibrium analysis in international economics. How to present international trade analysis using simple tools of economics as demand and supply curve, how to derive an offer curve, and how to depict change in international trade equilibrium using offer curves. Adam Smith, in his book Wealth of Nations, explains the importance of trade in the following abstract. It is the maxim of every prudent master of a family never to attempt to make at home what it will cost him more to make than to buy. The tailor does not attempt to make his own shoes, but buys them from the shoemaker. The shoemaker does not attempt to make his own clothes, but employs a tailor. The farmer attempts to make neither the one nor the other, but employs those different artificers. What is prudence in the conduct of every private family can scarce buy folly in that of a great kingdom. If a foreign country can supply us with a commodity cheaper than we make it, better buy it of them with some part of the produce of our own industry employed in a way we have some advantage. Let us first understand the meaning of partial equilibrium analysis. In partial equilibrium analysis, the effects of policy actions are examined only in the markets that are directly affected. Supply and demand curves are used to depict the price effects of policies. Producer and consumer surplus is used to measure the welfare effects on the participants in the market. A partial equilibrium analysis either ignores effects on other industries in the economy or assumes that the sector in question is very, very small and therefore has little, if any, impact on other sectors of the economy. Partial equilibrium analysis uses the domestic demand and supply to get the equilibrium. The international trade equilibrium conditions depict the condition of a nation when domestic supply is equal to domestic demand. The world price level at given domestic trade equilibrium determines whether a nation would export or import the commodity. This depends on the relative domestic and world prices. Moving on to the assumptions of the partial equilibrium analysis, the partial equilibrium analysis approach is based on the following assumptions. First, the world price level is given and is determined by world demand and supply. Second, the individual nation contributes a very small amount of world demand and supply. Third, the goods are traded free and there is zero transportation cost for imports and exports at world determined price level. Fourth, trade is allowed unhindered and there is no tariffs and non-tariff barriers on the free movement of goods across national boundaries. Fifth, the price of traded commodities remains fixed. Sixth, there is perfect competition in goods and factor market. Seventh, all the resources are fully employed. Assumptions of the model are very crucial for the validity and applicability of the partial equilibrium model. As partial equilibrium approach of international trade is based on the simplistic assumption outlined, it is essential to keep in mind while going through the analysis that it is valid only when given assumptions hold. Partial equilibrium analysis does not hold in the absence of these assumptions. In case of partial equilibrium, the world equilibrium occurs when import demand is equal to export supply. Import demand is negatively sloped, which implies that as price decreases, the demand for imported goods increases. When price of imported good decreases, then nation's consumer demand more, while the nation's producers supply less. So, the demand for imports decreases and import demand curve is negatively sloped. The export supply curve is positively sloped, indicating that as price of the exporting increases, producers in other nation produces more but consumers in that country consumes less. As a result, there is more quantity available for export purpose. That is why export supply curve is positively sloped. The world price is determined by the intersection of import demand curve and export supply curve. At the point of intersection, import demand by one nation is equal to the export supply by another nation. For simplicity, we have used demand in place of import demand and supply in place of export supply. The partial equilibrium analysis is based on the use of supply and demand curve of trade commodity. We will understand the partial equilibrium analysis of the two nations and one commodity case with help of the diagram. In the diagram panel A depicts the price of commodity X on vertical axis and quantity of commodity on horizontal axis. Dx is the demand curve and Sx is the supply curve of the commodity X in nation 1. The panel 2 shows the demand D and S of commodity X, where world equilibrium price and quantity is at the point of interaction of world demand and supply of commodity X, that is at point E dash. Panel 3 shows the supply Sx and demand Dx of commodity X in nation 2 at the world equilibrium price of commodity X. Nation 1 has excess supply of commodity X bracket BE bracket close, whereas Nation 2 has shortage of commodity X bracket B dash E dash bracket close at world price. International trade allows Nation 1 to export BE quantity of commodity and Nation 2 to import B dash E dash quantity of commodity X at world price level P2. Both nations benefit from international trade and world output and consumption is optimized as compared to autarky. This implies that when trade takes place, it results in a better condition of the economies than when the economies were self-independent. This analysis is a partial equilibrium model, thus focusing only on the market for a single good and ignoring any interactions with other markets. This is justified if the market in question is too small to matter for all other markets, in which case, unfortunately, it may be too small to matter for anything. Fortunately, the partial equilibrium model also provides a good approximation to what would be found with a more complete general equilibrium model, even for a market that does matter for others, as long as the feedbacks through those markets on itself are small. In practice, whether justified or not, the partial equilibrium model is very commonly used. Next, we shall now understand the case of general equilibrium analysis. Even though partial equilibrium is usually adequate and is much simpler than general equilibrium, it is important to understand general equilibrium that takes cross-market effect into account. A general equilibrium analysis incorporates the interaction of import and export sectors and then considers the effects of policies on multiple sectors in the economy. It uses offer curves to depict the equilibria and measures welfare with aggregate welfare functions or trade indifference curves. The general equilibrium analysis assumes that all variables used in analysis are changing simultaneously. It takes into account all the markets together. The actual model of international trade equilibrium analysis requires real-time data and analysis simultaneously to explain real-world scenario, but theoretically we use analytical and descriptive model to explain real world of international trade. The general equilibrium analysis of international trade uses community indifference curve to depict the taste and preference of a nation, production possibilities curve to explain technology and production condition, and relative commodity prices of the commodity to find out the equilibrium of partners involved in trade. The offer curves are derived using the production possibilities frontier, community indifference curve, and relative commodity prices. The offer curves were introduced by Marshall and Edgeworth in the field of international economics. The offer curve of a nation indicate how much of the import commodity a nation demands for it to be willing to supply various amounts of commodity it exports. Offer curve can be derived from production possibilities frontier, indifference map, and various hypothetical relative commodity prices at which trade could take place. In other words, offer curve represents willingness to trade at every possible terms of trade. Also, It is a curve showing for a two good model the quantity of one good that a country will export or offer for each quantity of the other that it imports. Also called the reciprocal demand curve, it is convenient for representing both exports and imports in the same curve and can be used for analyzing tariffs and other changes. Let us now look at the derivation of the offer curve diagrammatically. In these two diagrams, the PPF of two countries are drawn. PPF is concave to origin, representing increasing opportunity cost. The actual production point on PPF depends on the relative price of the good, and the economy produces that combination of output which maximizes the value of production. The market value of the output is given by the ISO value line, which is the line along which output remains same. The slope of the line is the relative price. The production point is determined by the tangency of ISO value line on the PPF curve. With increase in the relative price of the export good to import good of a nation, the ISO value line would become steeper, which results in a shift in the production point. As shown in the diagrams, the production and consumption lies on the same ISO value line. Consumption depends on the trade and preference of the consumers and are represented by indifference curve. The consumption point is highest possible welfare point and is determined by the tangency of ISO value line on the indifference curves. With an increase in the relative price of the export commodity to import commodity, the ISO value line gets steeper and production point changes. The economy moves to a higher indifference curve, which means economy is better off. This implies that economy can afford to import more of its commodity for a given volume of its export. The change in relative prices of the export commodity to import commodity also leads to a movement along the indifference curve towards more of import commodity and less of export commodity as export commodity has become relatively expensive. These two effects results into an improvement in welfare. Welfare increases due to income effect. The international terms of trade is the slope of a line passing through the point where the offer curves cross. Looking at the equilibrium condition graphically, we have the following diagram. The equilibrium takes into account demand and supply conditions in both countries into consideration. Equilibrium relative commodity price in the presence of trade is found at the intersection of offer curves for two nations. Only at this equilibrium price will trade be balanced. It is at this international equilibrium that the supply and demand are equalized in both markets at the same time. At any other relative commodity price, quantities of imports does not equal to the quantities of exports, which places pressure on the relative commodity price to move toward the equilibrium price. Further, we have the relationship between general equilibrium and partial equilibrium. Partial equilibrium looks only at a part of the economy. It leaves out a lot of effects which limits its use, but it gives results that are easy to derive and are transparent. Partial equilibrium analysis is not relevant to apply when there is an interrelationship between commodities or between factors. Thus, when markets for various commodities and factors are interdependent, that is, when changes in the price of a commodity or a factor have important repercussions on the demand for other commodities or factors, partial equilibrium analysis would not yield the desired results. However, when the changes in conditions of one market have significant effects on other markets, general equilibrium analysis should be used. In partial equilibrium analysis, when we consider the determination of market price of a commodity, we assume that the prices of other goods do not change. However, when the changes in conditions in one market have significant effects on other markets, general equilibrium analysis should be used. Thus, in partial equilibrium analysis, when we consider the determination of market price of a commodity, we assume that prices of other goods do not change. Thus, general equilibrium analysis is used. Both partial equilibrium and general equilibrium analysis use production frontiers and indifference maps to find equilibrium trade price. General equilibrium analysis considers all markets together, not just the market for a commodity X. Changes in the market for X affects other markets which possibly impact the market for X. General equilibrium analysis is therefore required for more complete analysis and realistic presentation of international trade. To sum up, partial equilibrium analysis focuses on explaining the determination of price and quantity in a given product or factor market when one market is viewed as independent of other markets. On the other hand, general equilibrium analysis deals with explaining simultaneous equilibrium in all markets when prices and quantities of all products and factors are considered as variables. Thus, in general equilibrium analysis, interrelationship among markets of all products and factors are explicitly taken into account.
This module can be summarized in the following points. First, the benefits received from free movement of goods are shared by the trade partners, which depend on their terms of trade. The terms of trade of a nation is defined as the ratio of the price of its export commodity to the prices of its import commodity. Since in a two-nation world, the exports of a nation are the imports of the other nation, therefore, the terms of trade of the latter is equals to the inverse of the terms of trade of the former. Second, the terms of trade decide the benefit of international trade under different conditions. If the effect of international trade is analyzed through the simple demand and supply condition, then the resultant analysis is known as partial equilibrium analysis, whereas the general equilibrium analysis uses the offer curves which are derived from the production possibility frontier and the indifference curve. Third, in partial equilibrium analysis, the effect of policy actions are examined only in the markets that are directly affected. Supply and demand curves are used to depict the price effect of policies. Producers and consumer surplus is used to measure the welfare effect on participants in the market. A partial equilibrium analysis either ignores the effect on other industries in the economy or assumes that the sector in question is very small and therefore has little if any impact on the other sectors of the economy. Fourth, in contrast, a general equilibrium analysis incorporates the intersection of import and export sectors and then considers the effect of the policies on the multiple sectors in the economy. It uses offer curves to depict the equilibria and measures welfare with aggregate welfare functions or trade indifference curves.